The collapse of the Ukrainian regime cannot be very far away, and I think I won't exaggerate that I say that it will happen within this year, but it might happen before the end of winter. Russians are advancing on the battlefield in a way that seems to be accelerated. When Alex Krainer talks about collapse, he's talking about momentum, not drama. War's in when one side can no longer sustain itself. If battlefield pressure keeps accelerating, collapse isn't sudden. It's inevitable. That I think that the lines of the front keep moving and faster. And I think that soon that they will have broken Ukraine's ability to defend their territory. And then from that point on, it might be relatively easier for them to get all the way to the Dnieper than it has been to just free up the remainder of Donbass and Lugansk. And then from there, I don't know if we'll see advance towards Mykolaiv and towards Odessa. But I believe that the most important thing for the Kremlin is who forms the government in Kyiv, the central government in Kyiv. And if they get a government that's going to fall back into a Russian orbit and become perhaps a friendly government or an ally like Belarus, then there's no need for further military conquest. They can control the country by administrative means by having a KF government on their side. If the West manages to defend a government that's Western-oriented and loyal to the Western centers of power, then maybe it becomes necessary for the Russians to take Odessa by force and to close the Black Sea off to the Western nations. I think we will find this out within this year, and probably before the summer. What Alex Krainer is really saying here is this: territory is secondary, power is political. If Moscow can shape who governs in Kyiv, tanks become unnecessary. Military conquest only continues if political control fails. Do you see Russia making a move against Odessa in the near future? Again, I think that will depend on who gets to form the government in Kyiv after Zelensky. I'm not completely convinced that Valerusny would be a Western player, pro-London, pro-NATO. Maybe. Time will prove me wrong. But I have a suspicion that Zelensky will turn out to be something different than what we think he is. We'll find out in time. But Odessa is extremely important because the Western powers, NATO, London, Berlin, Paris, they know that they lost this war, but what? What they want to preserve is a beachhead on Ukraine through which they could continue over time still to attack Russia in no quote-unquote asymmetric ways, through acts of sabotage and terrorism, with influx of drugs. Opium wars are a long tradition of the British Empire, through perhaps even biological weapons attacks, because that the Pentagon did own up to running 46 bio labs in Ukraine. What Alex Krainer is pointing to is simple. Odessa isn't about land. It's about leverage. If a Western-aligned government survives in Kyiv, Odessa becomes the last strategic foothold. If not, the reason for holding it disappears. And they're still running hundreds of labs in places like Georgia and in other nations surrounding Russia. So Odessa would be extremely important to have access to that beachhead. So the struggle for control of Odessa is certainly part of this war, but it doesn't. The Russians don't necessarily have to conquer Odessa militarily. It is enough that they gain control over the government in Kyiv, and then they can control Odessa through, customs inspections, through intelligence networks, through port authorities, and so forth. And they can close off that, let's call it, beachhead for Western interests. What Alex Krainer makes clear is this: control doesn't always require conquest. If Moscow influences Kyiv, Odessa can be neutralized administratively. Ports, customs, intelligence. Sometimes power is exercised quietly, not with tanks. The control of the Black Sea, the Western European and NATO. Sources have been explicit that okay, so maybe we lost Ukraine, but we have to continue the fight for control of the Black Sea. The fact that they can blow up Russian Ships, I think, doesn't change the strategic calculus here, you know it. It inflicts damage on Russia, but it doesn't gain the West any degree of victory over Russia, nor a possibility of, reversing Ukraine's defeat. What Alex Krainer is highlighting is a familiar illusion. Tactical hits don't equal strategic control. Damage managing ships may look like progress, but it doesn't reverse defeat or change who ultimately commands the Black Sea. So, I think that this is a little bit of triumphalism for public relations. Purpose is to rally the troops to have some good stories to tell, but without real effects, because ultimately, Russians can perfectly do to them what they do to the Russians. The Russians are being very restrained again because they don't want to give the collective West any pretext for them invoking Article 5 and uniting the NATO, but I think that the Russians will know to respond in asymmetric ways, and I think that they do that regularly, and in ways that are not necessarily visible and that there are not necessarily reportable in the news, but they happen nevertheless. To mention this because I never got to the bottom of it, but I was very intrigued that at some point, I forget what year that was, but I think it was at some point in 2022, that the Russians announced certain new submarines and they went on patrol to the Atlantic Ocean. So that was some kind of press release. And then a few weeks later, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, we had Richard Branson's space program, which they launched something which then simply vanished from the radar. The whole thing just disappeared. And I thought, I wonder if it wasn't the Russians. What Alex Krainer is warning about here is misreading the scoreboard. Public victories don't equal real power. Russia spectacle responds asymmetrically and often outside the news cycle. What isn't visible can still be decisive. I thought it was very strange that even the British didn't try to blame the Russians. It was embarrassing enough that they just tucked the story away and they made it disappear. And today, most people don't even remember that Richard Branson had space program, like Elon Musk did, and Jeff Bezos. The Brits had to have their own program because it's a prestige thing. If your own Richard Branson has a comparable program to what Elon Musk has and what Jeff Bezos is, then you're still one of the leading world powers. But from that day on, the whole program was scrapped. It was over. And I have to ask, did the Russians have anything to do with this? Because this was weeks after they sent their submarines on patrol to the Atlantic Oceans where they could have perfectly shot down Richard Branson's spaceship. I don't know, but I think that the Russians do that. I heard stories about them. They identified the locations of British SAS troops, and then they use that when they wish to retaliate against the British interest, and they just wipe out the SAS contingents, not just around Ukraine, but practically anywhere in the world that these things happen, but they can't happen in a way that then is obvious enough that they can say, this is Russian attacking Russians, attacking a NATO member nations, so we have to evoke Article 5 and unite against Russia. What Alex Krainer is hinting at is plausible deniability as strategy. Power isn't always loud or claimable. When responses stay unprovable, escalation is blocked, and that restraint can be more effective than open retaliation. What do you see after this war? Because we're not going to go back to let's call it the happy times of before 2014. No, certainly not. I think that there's going to be very radical changes happening in Europe. I think that as far as Ukraine goes, I tend to be optimistic because I think that once the settlement is reached, there's going to be a large-scale investment into reconstruction and rebuilding of Ukraine, and they will probably recover them, obviously not overnight, but over the next 10 or 20 years, Ukraine is going to become more prosperous than it probably has been since the Soviet times. I think that American investors, Russian investors, and Chinese investors are going to go in there, and they're going to be looking to integrate Ukraine into the VEU. No, multipolar integrations into the customs union and into the BRICS architecture. What Alex Krainer is pointing to is a hard truth. The old world is gone. Post-war Ukraine won't return to pre-2004 politics. It will be absorbed into a multipolar economic order where reconstruction, trade, and investment matter more than ideology, because it is an important node in the Eurasian, in the whole Eurasian network. I think that the United States, when I say American, Chinese, Russian investors, I'm talking probably about sovereign investment funds, and I think that this is part of the original 28-point peace plan that was produced by the Americans, which was envisioning a common $200 billion common fund administered by the Russians and the Americans jointly. And 100 billion of this would come from the frozen assets that are now in European custody. So this would be a strategic victory for Russia because it would be completely changing the security architecture for Europe. It would finally be addressing their security concerns, and I think that it would be a strategic defeat for the enemies of Russia. We have to when we talk about Germany, France, Poland, and all these other countries, as negative as the situation may appear today, we have to remember that up until a year ago, Russia's greatest enemy was the United States. The Blink and Sullivan administration. And then that changed with the election of Donald Trump, and now Russia and the United States are practically strategic partners. And so I think that if in the near future, if you had a regime change in Paris and a regime change in Berlin, let's say if gets to form a government and assembly, national in France gets to form a next government, then I think you could see a very important changes, and maybe this is because that the American national security strategy was talking about supporting these sovereigntist movements in Europe. So I assume that there are real ways of cooperation between Trump administration and the IFD and the Assembly National and government like that of Viktor Orban and in Babish and Robert FDO and so forth, and that this is turning the tides of and let's say the balance of power on the European continent. What Alex Krainer is describing here is a post-war reset, not a return. Reconstruction isn't just economic. It reshapes power. If Europe's security architecture changes, the real winners aren't governments, but the new balance that follows. And then we might have a very, very different relations that begin to be established between Russia and Germany, Russia and France, Russia and many. This is ultimately what motivated Steve Woff and Jared Kushner to discuss the Nord Stream pipelines, and this wasn't a one-off thing. The story about the Nord Stream pipelines and the Americans wanting to insert themselves into the administration of this trade in natural gas and oil between Russia and Europe. I think that's a real thing, and I think that this is maybe why, because they are already envisioning a wave of regime changes sweeping Europe. But let's say to the sides that got defeated on over Project Ukraine will be out of power, and the sovereigntist movement will significantly emboldened. And I think that speaking from Europe as a European, I see that as a very hopeful development. What Alex Krainer is ending on is quietly transformative. When energy, trade, and sovereignty realign, politics follows. If regime change sweeps Europe, relations won't be reset by ideology, but by mutual interest. That's not collapse. That's a reordering.